Welcome back to another episode of Financial History. Today we're going to be discussing a ancient but somewhat contentious financial innovation, namely debt. Debt, for the most part, is the bridge that we use to build over a transaction that has to be completed at different points in time. This is a little bit different than most transactions involving barter or currency, which are typically completed uh, at the time that goods or services are rendered. But strictly speaking, opportunities to delay the final settlement of a transaction until such time as payment can be rendered is in fact a very important, if subtle, technological advance in the use of finance. By being able to delay when a particular transaction gets completed, we have the opportunity no longer to focus on simply who can do their best at different activities now, but we can instead start to consider who is best at what activity at a particular point in time. For instance, we may have farmers that produce different kinds of crops at different times of years, but they need to trade them when their harvest is freshest. For instance, if my harvest comes due in August and your harvest comes due in October, you may wish to consume some of my harvest earlier. I may wish to consume some of your harvest later. So being able to delay the completion of a transaction or to finish the second half of the obligation can in fact lead to better specialization of effort. For instance, there are also opportunities where producers generally require materials or equipment up front before any kind of production can begin. If I hope to open a business making birdhouses, for instance, I most certainly am going to need to pay for my tools ahead of time, as well as my materials. And therefore, it can be fairly important for me, in hoping to establish this business, whether or not I can delay paying for those materials until I can generate some kind of revenue from the tools that I've received. So the use of the financing or debt in this way turns out to be very important to our ability to allocate resources efficiently across time and space. Now, when we think about the advantages of doing so, it's not simply a matter of people being able to specialize in different tasks. It also creates opportunities for people who might not be particularly valuable in the short term, who could, of course, become much, much more valuable. For instance, imagine a farmer who has an insufficient harvest some year. Rather than simply relying on the law of nature, which might extinguish the farmer due to starvation, we could instead provide them with credit to see them through a particularly difficult patch and return to productivity the following year. Similarly, a poor but particularly gifted student might be able to borrow to finance their education ahead of time, repaying that debt with interest as they are able to earn more with the human capital that they've developed. Now, finally, there's one other useful aspect of debt, which is worth pointing out, which is that sometimes specialists can develop, which are better at assessing the risks associated with debt. And in those cases, an intermediary who allocates on behalf of a saver might be able to create economic value. Now, that's something that we'll be discussing in a little bit more detail as we start to talk about banking and asset management later in the course. But suffice to say, outsourcing the management of savings is a very well established profession and has been going on for an extraordinary period of time. So what I'd like to do now is take you through a quick walk about some of the early debt systems that were used early on in human civilization, because I think it'll help us to understand exactly what the real benefits are, and of course, give us a bit of a foundation for where certain kinds of aspects of our debt technology came from. Anthropologically speaking, urbanization, which is of course one of the foundational sort of technologies that enabled us to move forward as humans, ultimately relies on broad group coordination systems to be able to effectively create value with all the different kinds of specialists we have. People who make oil, people who make pottery, people who make ropes, people who farm the land, people who are soldiers, people who are scribes. In order for us to really be able to build up a city properly, to be able to build a complex, large-scale network of specialists, at the end of the day, we're going to require some kind of system in order for us to be able to map out exactly who has provided what and who has the right to claim which kinds of resources. Now, the earliest kinds of coordination systems that we see that have left large archaeological footprints are things like granaries, which begin to appear a little over 10,000 years ago. Similarly, large-scale irrigation systems begin to develop approximately 6,000 years ago to 6,500 years ago, and then large temples and palaces begin to appear about 5,000 years ago. Each of these represents a large-scale coordination that was conducted in order to ultimately try to create more value. The real value that comes from these kinds of collective actions is that the cost of security is generally reduced, and any sort of fixed costs associated with these large projects can be spread over a large number of people, making it less expensive for each individual user as we collectivize the costs of storage and security. Now, of course, storage and security is not a free good. We have to recognize that someone bears the cost of supplying security, someone bears the cost of building a storage facility and supervising it, let alone keeping track of the records to allow people to deposit or withdraw into that system. And we see from very early on that the sort of collective storehouses of our civilizations do collect a fee in order to safeguard people's assets. In pharaonic Egypt, for instance, we notice that grains stored in state granaries is charged a rate of 10% interest a year. Now, what they did with this was to simply overestimate the loss rate and keep a bit for themselves. Meanwhile, in Akkad, if we move back towards the Fertile Crescent, what we notice is by 2000 BC, the temple at Akkad is accepting deposits of cattle, among other things, in exchange for a flat deposit fee of 1/6 of whatever was deposited. So you bring 30 cattle, you're only going to get 24 back. Now, as the volume of saved assets rises, one of the important considerations, of course, is that that means more spoilage, more theft, more requirements for space, more guards. So this leaves us with a tricky situation. What do we do with society's stored surplus? Should it effectively sit in a box and wait to be used? Or should we attempt to recirculate these slack resources, particularly in an environment that's dominated by concepts of scarcity? So, of course, as we built up sufficient amounts of surplus capital in this way, we eventually got around to coordinating and financing very, very large projects, much larger than granaries. And the first of these sort of large-scale coordination systems are generally the Sumerian city-states, where they tend to center around, at first, temples and then large palaces, who act as a central coordination system for all of the different kinds of resources that are produced in the cities. Now, we can note that the evolution of these city-states follows a particular path. Originally, Sumerian gods in the pre-writing period are very nature-based and are broadly worshipped in a multi-theistic pantheon. However, as we move towards urbanization, we see that the Sumerian religion changes to some extent, and that each city begins to adopt its own unique individual patron that represents the city itself. And therefore, we can see how the need to coordinate people in large city-scale groups required the creation of some kind of bond of affiliation that could unite all of the people in that common community towards some particular end. Now, given that we've built up, after a few years, an enormous amount of surplus in these temples, what we notice is that the temples begin to create loans. They begin to lend out some of this excess surplus to those that they deem sufficiently worthy. And of course, this creates the possibility of those people who might borrow from the collective enterprise to lend back to the people whose surplus has been used in the first place. But we'll be discussing banking in our next major lesson. Suffice to say that loans were not only extended to people who were looking to profit from relending the money or even investing it themselves. Many loans from the early Sumerian period reflect the fact that people who were expected to make contributions to the collective were not always able to do so, sometimes due to inclement weather and injury, etc., and that they would frequently fall into debt to the collective after failing to remit the appropriate taxes. So this shows you an example of how early debts can be formed, even without an explicit loan being taken out necessarily. To get a sense of how the early Sumerians coordinated, It's worth noting that they used small clay tokens, as discussed in our lecture on payment systems. We can see at right here what are called boulet, or clay balls, within which these small clay tokens would have been left and to a particular date. What each of these clay tokens symbolizes are different kinds of debts denoted in different kinds and quantities of commodities. In order to record that debt in the future and to make sure that the record was difficult to tamper with, these little clay pieces were sealed inside of a clay envelope, or boulet, which had a date on it. And once the date was reached, the ball would be broken open, and we could tell exactly what the quantity owed between the two parties happened to be. In order to identify the two parties, these kinds of clay boulet were often sealed with what was called a cylinder seal, which was effectively a way of embossing the seal with a unique image that could be used to denote who the borrower or the lender happened to be. Now, unsurprisingly, as we invent writing about 5,000 years ago with the advent of cuneiform, this type of system dies off. But it's important to recognize that debt is an ancient and somewhat foundational technology for humans. And it didn't necessarily just emerge in the Middle East. We see actually debt appearing in a number of different civilizations and even pre-civilization groups of people. One of the early forms of debt management or record keeping was to use what was called a tally stick. A tally stick involves creating some kind of device that has a number of marked notches on it that effectively evaluate what is owed by one party. Now, the tally sticks effectively acted as a form of receipt, whereby the owner of the lender would keep the tally as a form of record to indicate that the person who had co-signed the tally still had an obligation to them that was laid out on this particular tally. An evolution of this happens during the Warring States period in China, about 24 centuries ago, where we begin to see bamboo, which happens to split conveniently well, being used to create two-sided tally sticks, so that each party to the transaction could retain their own record, and the debt was deemed to be legally discharged when the half of that was kept by the lender was returned to the borrower. And that would free the borrower from their discharge. Now, it's interesting to think that this is a fairly ancient world technology. In fact, the Ashango bone suggests that tally sticks may have been used as early as 10, 20,000 years ago. What's amazing about them is that the receipt of the exchequer, the United Kingdom's government, actually used tally sticks to keep track of people's tax payments until 1834, when they finally moved to destroy all of the ancient tallies that had been kept in the basement of Parliament. There's an interesting story here at the link that you can follow that describes the destruction of the tallies in 1834 and how this led to a massive fire that destroyed the British Parliament buildings, as you can see here on the bottom right. Needless to say, it was an accident, of course, but it goes to show you the danger of retaining piles and piles of flammable receipts in one's house. So thankfully, we've been able to move towards computerized records in the last few decades, and so the risk of giant fires among the receipts has been substantially attenuated.